Once upon a time there was a happy ship called the Arandora Star. She would take people to sunny climes far from the British winter. But in 1940 her colourful livery and all the happy memories disappeared forever as Europe was plunged into the darkness of war and the Arandora Star was painted the drab grey of a troop ship. Join us on the north coast of Ireland and hear the story of her last voyage. Wonderful, isn't it? Welcome to the North Coast. I have loved this place from the moment I saw it over 50 years ago, and I know many of its stories, tales of 500-year-old castles like this one at Dunluce, tales of the giant Finn McCool and his causeway, tales of Spanish galleons wrecked on these fearsome cliffs. There are happy stories and sad stories, but none more tragic than this one. From high on the cliffs, look west to Malin Head on the horizon. Somewhere beyond the line of clouds, deep beneath the Atlantic, lies the wreck of the Arandora Star. Benvenuti ai nostri amici in Italia. Welcome to our friends in Italy. Sono Michael McRitchie.
E sono Brenda McRitchie.
We live near Belfast, about 65 miles from this, our favourite place. Behind us, to the west, is Malin Head, and to the east, in front of us, is Rathlin Island. That's it, on the horizon. Rathlin is the burial place of Giuseppe Capella, one of the hundreds of Italians who died when the Arandora Star was torpedoed on July the 2nd, 1940. 3 years ago we went to Rathlin to photograph his grave for his family. This was the start of a journey which would take us all round the northwestern coasts of Ireland and finally to Bardi in northwestern Italy, the area where so many of the victims came from. Our story of the Arandora Star is told in the words of the newspapers of the time and of the people who were there when it happened. And as we learnt more and more about the terrible events on that day in 1940, we decided to make this video for the families of Bardi. This is our tribute to them and to all who were lost off our coasts.
Why did it happen? By the middle of 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The German army was massing in the Channel ports and their invasion was expected any day. At sea, the U-boats were strangling the lifeline to America. In the skies, the Battle of Britain was nearing its climax. On June the 10th, Italy declared war on Britain. In this desperate situation, all enemy aliens were arrested. With starvation a real possibility, the government ordered that these internees be shipped to Canada. On July the 1st, the Arandora Star left Liverpool, carrying 1,200 German and Italian prisoners, guarded by 200 soldiers.
She sailed past the Isle of Man, where many Italians were interned, through the North Channel between Scotland and Ireland, then west past Malin towards Canada. At about 8:30 next morning, when she was about 70 miles west of Ireland, she was torpedoed by the submarine U-47. The Arandora Star sank in half an hour. There was not enough lifeboats to begin with, and 2 were destroyed in the explosion. That afternoon, many were rescued by a Canadian destroyer which had answered the ship's distress call, but more than 800 of the 1,600 men aboard lost their lives. Some went down with the ship, some drowned, and some were smothered in the tons of thick fuel oil which covered the surface of the sea. For weeks, the bodies of Italians, Germans, the British seamen and the army guards were washed ashore along 600 miles of coastline, from the Western Isles of Scotland to County Mayo in Ireland. Of the 446 Italians who perished that day, less than 20 were identified. Some of these are buried in the Scottish Islands. There's 2 near Malin Head and 1 in County Mayo. We have found 27 unidentified victims buried along these northwestern Irish coasts. Our journey today will take us to Malin Head, the most northerly point in Ireland, then southwest to County Mayo, and finally back to our starting point on Rathlin Island. In early August, a northwesterly gale brought a terrible harvest to the Irish coast. In the next few weeks, dozens of victims were laid to rest in 29 cemeteries along 200 miles of coastline. From Rathlin Island in the northeast to Erris in the far west. This is Ireland's sad legacy from the Arandora Star. On the long drive to Malin Head, we wondered about the lives of the Italians who had come so far to die lonely deaths in the Atlantic. Most of them were older men. Giuseppe Capello was 55 and had been a waiter in the Savoy Hotel in London. They were simple, hard-working people who had come from poor regions of Italy to work in cafes, restaurants, and of course the ice cream business. Many had worked in Britain for years, but in those desperate days, all were picked up and interned. This is my native city of Belfast, which has had an Italian community for hundreds of years. Many were arrested after Italy declared war and interned on the Isle of Man, but this is the sad story of the 2 who went on the Arandora Star. In those early days, fascism was seen as the symbol of a resurgent Italy and a force for good, certainly not as it's seen today. In Belfast, the fascisti paraded to the cenotaph on Armistice Day because Italy had fought with the Allies in World War I. Our Italian community, pictured here shortly before the war, was as highly regarded as it is today. Giuseppe Forti owned the Continental Cafe in Castle Street. He was the leader of the Belfast Fascisti, and the deputy leader was his nephew Antonio Fusco. Signor Forti was arrested as soon as Italy declared war. But the Antonio Fusco who was also arrested wasn't his nephew, but another Tony Fusco who wasn't even a fascist. Tony's family had lived in Britain for almost 30 years, and he worked in the family chip shop in York Street, as did his younger brother Alfredo. Now aged 90 and still living in Belfast, Freddie Fusco recalled what happened.
I was born in Dunfermline in 1919, the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, and my mother and father, they came here earlier on from Italy, Casalatico, a province of Frosinone. I came to Belfast in 1930 with my family, and I've been here ever since. The security forces came and took my brother away because he was born in Italy, and he was put on the Arandora Star. We lost him. I never seen him since. So they interned my father, but they only held him for a few weeks, and then they let him go all through illness.
Long afterwards, the Fusco family heard that Tony had stepped forward when he heard his name called at the docks. The authorities didn't realise they had the wrong Fusco. It was said that Tony had volunteered to go with Signor Forti, rather than have him go alone from what had become their home city of Belfast. This is the road north to Malin Head, looking out into the Atlantic towards America. The first of the victims from the Arandora Star were recovered from this coastline. The old buildings at Malin Head looked like a fortress, but they must withstand gales of 120 miles an hour in winter. This tower was built in 1801 to report shipping movements to London. It was here that they received the distress call from the Arandora Star. A short distance away is the wartime Coast Guard watch house. Through this very window they watched the Arandora Star passing earlier that morning. In the days before aviation, the ocean liner was the only way to travel. In times of war they became troop ships, moving armies from one battlefield to another. And that's why, beneath these storm-tossed waters around Malin Head, there are more liners on the bottom of the sea than anywhere else in the world, the victims of 2 world wars. Out there is the Arandora Star, 6,000 feet beneath the waves. And not far beyond her is the submarine which sank her and which would join her on the bottom of the Atlantic less than a year later. The U-boat commander, Capitan Preen, had no idea, of course, that he was attacking his Italian allies and his countrymen. Painted naval grey, with no markings, the Arandora Star was just another troop ship. It was his duty to attack. The results of that attack became apparent a few weeks later. On August 17, 1940, the Donegal Vindicator newspaper reported that 9 bodies from the Arandora Star had been recovered from the sea around this northwest coast. Some were those of soldiers, some were unidentified Italians, some could not be identified at all. The Donegal Democrat newspaper reported the finding of yet more bodies, including a British soldier, Clive Darrell, who was found in a lifebelt bearing the name Arandora Star, a 27-year-old German airman who had been one of the German prisoners, and an Italian internee called Giovanni Ferdenzi from Vernasca near Bardi. More than 90 of the British guards were drowned and were identified through their army identity discs, but the civilians had only a few papers, which seldom survived 4 weeks in the ocean. On August the 24th, the Donegal Democrat reported that the body of a soldier was washed up on a beach, the body of an unidentified seaman was washed up on an island, together with a lifeboat from the Arandora Star. 2 unidentified bodies were buried on an island where they were found, and by the evening the shores of Loch Ross Bay on the western coast were strewn with wreckage, including pieces of lifeboat, ship's furniture, pieces of cork from lifebelts, and thousands of tiny pieces of wood. Who would not have been moved by this terrible disaster? Listen to the South Donegal coroner, Dr. John O'Sullivan, who returned verdicts of death by drowning on 2 unidentified bodies which had been washed ashore on August the 10th. Like so many others, these men met cruel deaths, and it is possible that their dear ones will never learn the facts of their fate. I am sure we shall all breathe a prayer for the happy repose of their souls, and ask the Almighty to bring comfort to the hearts of their grief-stricken relatives. One family, the Camozzi's, did find out what happened. Cesare Camozzi left Iseo in northern Italy at the age of 20 and opened his first restaurant in Manchester 4 years later. He married Minnie in 1924, and in 1931 he opened his second restaurant, the Monogram, where he lived until his arrest in 1940 at the age of 49. He was taken to Scotland, then to Liverpool, where he was put aboard the Arandora Star. A policeman, Garda Duffy, told the inquest that one of the bodies found on the coast near Malin Head carried a letter addressed to a Mr. Cesare Camozzi at an internment camp in Scotland. The letter was headed Monogram Cafe in Manchester and was signed, "Your affectionate wife, Minnie." Garda Duffy said that he then telephoned the Monogram Cafe and was answered by a lady who said she was the wife of Cesare Camozzi and that she had written the letter found on the body of the dead man. What a call to have to make. What a terrible call to receive. This is the cemetery in the little town of Carndonagh near Malin Head. We're in one of the poorest areas of Ireland, where people have long emigrated to find better lives. Perhaps this is why they still remember Cesare Camozzi. The people of Carndonagh attended his funeral, they held a mass on what would have been his 100th birthday, and they still tend his grave today. On his grave is a cross, formed from pebbles from the beach where his body was found. In the nearby village of Culdaff is St Bundan's Church and the grave of Private Clive Darrell of the Welsh Regiment, the army guard who came ashore in the Arandora Star lifebelt. In the next village of Fawn, beside the sailors lost in 2 world wars, is the grave of another guard, Private Percy Palmer. On August the 12th, the body of Giovanni Ferdenzi of Castelletto, a tiny village near Bardi, floated onto this beach near Clonmany, south of Malin Head. His cousin Giacomo also died on the Arandora Star. Both men had been working in London, where Signor Ferdenzi had a business delivering ice to cafes and shops in the days before refrigeration. The people of Clonmany buried the remains of Giovanni Ferdenzi in their churchyard, and they tend his grave to this day. The Italian author Maria Serena Balestracci did much to reawaken interest in the Arandora Star in her 2002 book La Tragedia Dimenticata, The Forgotten Tragedy. Perhaps because so many terrible events were to follow, the tragedy was indeed forgotten, except by the hundreds of families who lost their loved ones. Surprisingly, it was forgotten in Ireland too, although it was one of the worst disasters off our coast. We uncovered much of this story from 1940 newspapers and from the few people who still remember it. But after years of searching, the official records were finally discovered in the Irish National Archives in Dublin. There, in the curt language of officialdom, its carbon copies yellowed and brittle with age, we can see the police reports on the men who came in from the sea. Here are descriptions of the bodies, their heights, the clothing they wore, their possessions, such as watches, cufflinks, coins, anything which might have helped to identify them. In only one case, we did. We've come to Fanad Head, the next headland west from Malin Head. There's Malin over there, only 15 miles away, but we've had to drive 80 miles round this long sea inlet called Lough Swilly. 69 years later, here is the Garda report that on August 6, 1940, a man's body was found on the rocky coast near Fanad. The body was that of a man aged about 40 and 6 feet tall, dressed in a blue suit, and in his wallet there were photographs, papers in the Italian language, and a paid cheque dated 1935 and drawn on a London bank for £14,400, a vast sum for those days, perhaps £750,000 today. The cheque had been paid out to Ugo Cioli and was signed by Marco Baccanello. But there was no address or any other details, and so the mystery man was buried in the stranger's graveyard above the village of Kerrykeele. We found a Baccanello in the casualty lists, and we located the Baccanello family in London. They told us that the brothers Marco and Ugo Baccanello, who emigrated from Venice, had been arrested in London and put aboard the Arandora Star. Ugo survived to be sent to internment in Australia aboard the Dunera. He named his son after his brother, who was drowned. But until now, the family did not know that 40-year-old Marco's body had been recovered. He lies somewhere among the graves of the children. And the cheque? The family has no idea. From Kerrykeele, it's a 45-mile drive through the Donegal Mountains to the west coast and the cemetery at Marragallen, near Bunbeg. Far beyond the horizon is the Arandora Star, and here lie her victims, 2 soldiers, a crewman, and at least 5 unidentified Italians who are buried between the soldiers' headstones. Here too is the body of Leonello Corriere, who had owned a shop in Wallasey, and who was identified by a letter from his daughter, which was found in his pocket.
On July the 30th, 4 weeks after the sinking, the body of Ernesto Moruzzi floated in from the Atlantic and was washed up on this beach at Cloughlass near Burtonport on the west Donegal coast. Senior Moruzzi, who came from Bardy, was 61 and had owned a cafe in Neath, South Wales, where his family lives to this day. The Garda report states that he was dressed in grey tweed trousers, blue striped shirt and blue socks. In his wallet were 5 religious medals, a crucifix, and a card from the Neath Constitutional Club which bore his name and address. He is buried on Torpedoed Island, alongside him a number of unidentified Italians who were also found along this coastline. At the front of the cemetery is a line of war graves, at the far end of which is the headstone of Private Peter Clark from Devon, one of the Army Guards from the Arandora Star. He was 17.
By late August, there was real concern about the cost to a small and very poor community of dealing with so many casualties. The Donegal Board of Health was told that 33 bodies had been washed ashore during the previous week, and that their funeral expenses had been paid by board officers out of their own pockets. Along this coast there were so many bodies that they reopened old graveyards, some of which had not been used since the Irish famine almost 100 years before. In those days, this was a very isolated area reached by gravel roads normally used by donkey carts. Only a few professional people, like doctors, had cars, and petrol was rationed. Very few people had telephones, so it was difficult to assemble the coroner, his staff and a 12-man jury for scores of inquests along 200 miles of this wild coastline. As the scale of the disaster unfolded, it was agreed that local doctors could authorise the burial of war victims. The local people did incredibly well in the face of this terrible tragedy, but we shall never know the identities of most victims or the exact location of their graves. This is a newspaper report on the finding of bodies along the coastline. And this is a man who was there when it happened. Eugene Fordovisky is now 82, and he's at the exact spot where he watched the bodies of Arandora Star victims being recovered from this rocky shore on August the 10th, 1940. One of the bodies was that of Matteo Fossaluzza of Cavasso in northeast Italy, and the other had a distinctive ex-serviceman's lapel badge which may have identified him. The third body was that of a soldier, Private Mitchell, and we're standing round his headstone. Eugene remembers that the 3 men were buried alongside each other. He explained that civilian casualties were buried without headstones in poor ground, that part of the cemetery set aside for those who could not afford graves. Such burials were not recorded, which explains why only Private Mitchell appears in the church records.
Oh, in 1940 I was 16 years of age, yeah. Yeah, I'm 82 years now, you know.
You're weathering well.
Weathering well is right. The word went out that there were bodies found washed in at the shore, on the shore. And a lot of people went down just to curiosity. And what I saw was 2 men, 2 bodies, and one of them I know, as I told you already, that he had a bluish type of a suit on him, a suit of clothes, and one shoe, there was one shoe missing, and the other body, well, it was a bit decomposed, but not as bad, not too bad now. But the man in the blue suit seemed to have survived the sea better than the other fella. So
they took the bodies to the courthouse?
They took they took the bodies to the courthouse, and they remained there. And as far as I can remember now, they remained there for 3 or maybe 5 days or 5 nights. They were all buried here on on the ground that they're in now.
Yes.
They were all buried there. But anyway, some years later, some people came. I don't know who they were, but they said they were
Yes.
relations of two of the bodies,
Yes.
and they were taken away by them people.
The same newspaper report also referred to the finding of 3 more unidentified bodies 5 miles away at Dromore West. They were interred somewhere in this area of Dromore West churchyard. 1 wore seaman's clothing, the other 2 were probably Italians, but who they were we shall never know. Of the 446 Italians who perished that day, 1 in 10 came from around the hilltop town of Bardi in northern Italy. This terrible loss is still felt by the people of Bardi, who built this chapel in memory of all those who had died. 54 of the victims had settled in South Wales, where their cafes and shops were a part of the mining communities. They included 5 members of the Rabeotti family, aged between 28 and 59. The body of Francesco Rabeotti was recovered from the Mayo coastline and after the war was reburied in the family tomb here in Bardi. Guido Conti of Bardi was 32 and had been working in Newport, South Wales. Today, his nephew Beppe has charge of the chapel.
Buongiorno a tutti, sono Beppe Conti, sono il responsabile della piccola associazione, del piccolo comitato pro vittime Arandora Star di Bardi. Mi trovo nella cappella dell'Arandora Star del cimitero di Bardi, in quello che vuole essere il simbolo, in quello che vuole essere il segno della luce, della speranza, del ricordo dei nostri cari, di tutti i nostri cari, non solo dei bardigiani. Voglio ricordare Cesare Camozzi, Antonio Fusco, Giovanni Ferdenzi, con grande affetto per loro, con grande affetto per tutte le famiglie, con grande affetto e riconoscenza per tutti quelli che mi aiutano, che ci aiutano a ricordare i nostri caduti, a ricordarli ai giovani, a ricordarli alle generazioni future, per far capire questa tragedia, per far capire la tragedia dell'emigrazione, per capire anche meglio noi italiani la nuova immigrazione verso l'Europa, verso il nostro paese. Grazie a tutti, venite a trovarci, venite a sostare, chi ha fede con una preghiera, chi non l'ha con il silenzio, qui a Bardi, alla cappella dell'Arandora Star, dove c'è il simbolo della speranza, dove c'è sempre un fuoco acceso di speranza per tutte le famiglie. Grazie.
This is the Erris Peninsula in County Mayo, one of the most remote parts of Ireland. On July the 30th, 1940, exactly 4 weeks after the sinking, the body of Giovanni Marenghi of Bardi was washed up on this sandy beach on the west coast. He was 43 and he had owned a shop in Wales. The newspaper reporter left us a detailed account of how he identified Senior Marenghi by his membership card from the Pontypridd Bowling Club and his food ration book. The Marenghi family was able to have his body returned, and in February 1941 he was laid to rest in Pontypridd Cemetery. Other unidentified Italians were buried at Termancara, the cemetery you can see in the distance. They were the first of many, for the full horror of the Arandora Star's sinking was about to become apparent. This peaceful scene is Inishkea Island, 5 miles off the Erris coast, but the scene was very different in August 1940. Erris Head is one of the wildest places in Ireland. Like Malin, no trees grow here because of the Atlantic gales. Yet when 2 bodies were seen floating in a cave, the local policeman, Garda Donoghue, and a farmer called Pat Riley left this little slipway in a tiny canvas-covered boat called a curragh. They rowed through the stormy seas to the cave, they attached ropes to the bodies, and the local people hauled them up this 60-metre cliff. Both bodies wore civilian clothes, and they were probably Italians. They too were buried in Termancara. More and more bodies were washed ashore. There was one for every kilometre of coastline. And the Board of Health became very concerned at the cost of so many funerals, with coffins costing £2 10 shillings each. Today's equivalent sum would be about £330. And this was one of the poorest areas in Ireland. Termancara has been the burial ground of the people of Erris for centuries. Their graves are marked by simple stones placed on the sandy soil. The bodies of the unknown victims were buried in the north corner of the cemetery. Between the soldiers' headstones are the graves of gli Italiani sconosciuti, the unknown Italians who travelled so far to end on this wild Atlantic coastline.
Termancara overlooks Anna Head. It was here, according to a vivid newspaper report, that 3 local men waded into the raging sea with a rope to save a body from the jagged rocks. It was another of the guards, Private William Chick from Dorchester. The inquest was told that when the photo of a girl, perhaps sister or sweetheart, was found in his wallet, the onlookers were in tears. 19-year-old William rests forever in the cemetery at Kilcommon, with 3 of his comrades from the Arandora Star.
What of the 100 bodies seen off Inishkea Island, 12 miles south of Termancara? Only a few were recovered, such was the ferocity of the storm. Private Darnell, one of the British Guards, was buried in this 700-year-old cemetery at Falmore, in sight of the place where he was found. The others rest somewhere in this cemetery. Their graves have no markers, and we'll never know who they were. We do know that the bodies were treated with reverence, and that the local people attended the funerals of all those who had met such terrible deaths. As in Donegal, these small communities made tremendous efforts to cope with a terrible disaster. As to the rest of the bodies, only 10 miles south of here are the forbidding cliffs of Rathlin Island, at over 2,000 feet, the highest sea cliffs in Europe. Nothing could survive the conflict between raging seas and rocky cliffs. For so many, the vast Atlantic is their grave. We have travelled 230 miles from Inishkea in the west to the little town of Ballycastle on the north coast. From this harbour the ferry goes to Rathlin, 12 kilometres to the north. On the horizon is Fairhead, beyond it the Mull of Kintyre in Scotland. The bodies of Giuseppe Capella and another Italian who was never identified were found on a rocky inlet at the west end of Rathlin Island. Today they rest in the churchyard of St. Thomas, on the shore of Church Bay in the distance. Beside the town of Ballycastle is Bonamarghy Friary, founded by the Franciscans over 500 years ago. In the second week of August 1940, the bodies of 2 merchant seamen were recovered from the sea near here and were buried in this cemetery on August the 11th, the day before Giuseppe Capella was buried on Rathlin. It seems certain that these 2 unknown seamen were crew members from the Arandora Star. They might even be those of her officers, for Captain Edgar Moulton and his colleagues were seen to supervise the evacuation and to go down with their ship. We're aboard the ferry leaving Ballycastle for Rathlin Island, which has long connections with Colonsay, the Scottish island where another victim, Giuseppe del Grosso, is buried. Both he and Giuseppe Capella came from Borgotaro. Perhaps they knew each other. There's our favourite place, the 200-metre cliffs of Fairhead, which form the northeastern corner of Ireland. In the distance, the Mull of Kintyre, Scotland. These waters have long been a hunting ground for submarines. On this short voyage, we pass over at least 7 ships torpedoed in the 2 world wars. Ahead is the little settlement of Church Bay on Rathlin Island. After 45 minutes, the ferry enters the little harbour at Church Bay. We are climbing to the top of the island. This is Rathlin's eastern coastguard station. From here they watched the Arandora Star passing on that summer's evening in 1940. Rathlin is a bleak and windswept island with only 100 inhabitants. On the horizon is Torhead on the west side of the Irish Sea. Coming into view is the Scottish coast. Between them is the North Channel between Ireland and Scotland. Through this channel came the Arandora Star. We have come down the hill to Church Bay, the only landing place on Rathlin. Across its peaceful waters are St. Thomas's Church and the churchyard. A short walk round the shore, the last journey of Giuseppe Capella and his unknown countryman, brings us to our journey's end.
The churchyard has numerous war graves, mostly seamen from the 2 world wars. Behind the church, between the graves of a British airman and a British sailor, is the last resting place of Giuseppe Capella and his unknown companion. They are just 2 among the millions who died in the Great Conflict, and the Arandora Star is but one of 1,000 tragedies. Yet who could not be moved by their lonely deaths in the vast Atlantic? We remember all who died on the Arandora Star. They are far from home, but they are among friends.